is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Global Business Europe, live from CGTN in London. I'm Paul Barber.
And I'm Juliet Mann. Our top stories. Spying on your friends. New allegations that Denmark helped the US with surveillance on key allies.
China allows couples to have 3 children as birth rates fall in the world's most populous country.
Is it bye-bye, Bibi? Netanyahu's rivals work to finalise a coalition to unseat Israel's longest-serving leader.
And laugh out loud. France reopens its theatres, cinemas and comedy clubs after 6 months of shutdown.
The culture sector in France is ready to stage its post-lockdown revival.
Germany says it's seeking clarification following reports that Denmark's military helped the United States spy on leading European politicians, including German leader Angela Merkel.
Danish and other European media outlets claim the alleged spying occurred between 2012 and 2014 during the Obama administration. Danish radio says America's National Security Agency used Danish military intelligence to spy on officials from allies, including Sweden, Norway and France.
In a moment, we will speak to John Terrett in New York, but first let's go to Ryan Thompson in Frankfurt. Ryan, can you give us a bit more background and how Denmark is allegedly involved?
Yeah, the origin of this spying is from the Danish military intelligence agency, FE, and what's really interesting here is that the Danish government was aware of the spying at least by 2015, though the spying was occurring many, many years earlier. And it even includes some espionage within Denmark on the Danish finance minister, the Danish foreign minister, and including a weapons manufacturer as well. Edward Snowden first sounded the alarm about America and the National Security Administration beginning this type of intelligence observance on Europe many, many years ago. But the big revelation that we learned today is just how high up it went. It included the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, it included the German President, it included a number of high-level European ministers across that wide range of European countries that you were just naming there. I spoke to an intelligence analyst a bit earlier today to try and put these events in context. What does this all mean? He told me that, interestingly here, it is not about friendships, this is not about ethics, this is all about pursuing Denmark's interests. So clearly there was some type of tit-for-tat information that Denmark was after, or at least the FE intelligence agency was after, to comply with the NSA and work this all out. But what's really striking here is that they've gone up not just against allies, but against European allies within the bloc.
Ryan, how have German and other European officials reacted?
Yeah, well, the government spokesperson has said that the Chancellor is aware of the fact that she was spied on. She was trying to get, journalists were trying to reach her for comment to know if she was aware, and they confirmed that fact. He said that the government is currently in consultations with internally but also externally to figure out what to do next on this. Of course, that spying also included France, and it happens to coincide with a high-level meeting between all of France's ministers and all of Germany's ministers. One of France's Europe minister, Clément Beaune, went on French radio today saying that these are quite serious allegations, especially the fact that these aren't just allies, these are European allies, and if it is true, they will have to take serious steps. These facts must be verified. We are watching the French president meet with his German counterpart now, and we're taking an eye out to see if they comment on this and what steps they might take and how they are pursuing action within the European project.
Thanks very much, Ryan. Ryan Thompson there in Frankfurt.
Well, let's head to the United States now, where John Terrett is standing by in New York. John, have we had any reaction to all of this from the United States?
Well, Juliet and Paul, you have to remember this is fairly early in the day for us over here. It's only midday, and it's also a major public holiday, so nothing really yet. It's not really on the radar of Americans at this moment. But I do think that what is new for us here in America is these two tweets that have come out from Edward Snowden within the last news cycle. The first one, the cryptic one in Danish, rather sarcastic one, I think you might say, says, "If only there had been some reason to investigate many years ago. Oh, why didn't anyone warn us?" Of course, he tried to. It's part of the story. But the second tweet, I think, is of more interest to Americans at this time, or will be soon, because Snowden writes that Biden is well prepared to answer for this when he soon visits Europe, since, of course, he was deeply involved in the scandal first time round. And what he's referring to here is the new information about the time period of 2012 to 2014, when, of course, President Obama was in the White House and Joe Biden was his vice president. So this kind of gives the indication, at least from Edward Snowden, that it went all the way to the top. It wasn't just the intelligence services going rogue, as it were, that people in the White House knew what was going on. Now, the president himself, President Biden, as he now is, of course, has spent the last couple of hours, he's just left Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., which is hallowed ground there. This is where Americans bury their war heroes, and he's just given a very unifying speech to the country from that site. But as I say, it is Memorial Day, so I'm not really expecting any comments today, and possibly no comment at all, because, of course, the US doesn't comment on clandestine operations, generally speaking. Juliet.
Well, let's throw ahead then to the meeting in Europe at the end of the week, because Joe Biden,
Yes.
he's trying to reset his relationships with Europe, isn't he? And he's going to be early June here in the UK for that G7 meeting. So
Yes.
this could be potentially damaging for him.
Well, a little bit. I mean, he certainly does have a busy June coming up. I mean, on the 11th to the 13th, he's in Cornwall for the G7 meeting, and then on the 14th he's in Brussels for the NATO leaders meeting, and of course he has that summit with President Putin in the Swiss city of Geneva on June the 16th. Now, Biden's foreign policy at the moment is Asia. Okay, it's not really Europe, not really, but he's very keen to repair the relationships with NATO countries and European countries that he thinks were damaged during the 4 years of President Trump. Now, the other thing that is new about this for us here is that Denmark helped the United States. According to the revelations, that Denmark actively helped them do what they wanted to do in that time period. And that is because Denmark sits atop a number of incoming internet hubs from Eastern Europe, from Europe and other parts of the world. So it will make things very awkward when he meets leaders at these various summits. They will say, well, why'd you do it? Because if you'd phoned us up, we would have told you the information. Also, most of the information that you could possibly have gleaned is available on our radio and our television and in our newspapers. And Mr. Biden will say, well, look, sorry about that. It was a long time ago. We don't do it anymore. And everybody will move on. I think it's also worth pointing out that the Germans, who were the focus of this, apparently, have a long history of scandals of this kind of their own. And I think the other point that is very well worth making is that since the end of the Cold War, friendly countries, have been spying on each other even more than they used to. They always used to do it, but since the end of the Cold War, they've been doing it a lot more. The reason that the spying that they do is related to economies and industries. That's really what they want to know. And it's not really the John le Carrier spying that we see on television and in novels, but we do know that they all do it, Juliet.
Oh, so it's business or politics, as usual. John Terrett in New York, thank you.
World leaders are holding talks at a climate summit hosted virtually by South Korea. There are calls for more action by all countries in the drive towards a cleaner and greener planet. Speaking at the summit, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said the world is in a make-or-break decade for climate change.
Europe aims to be the first climate-neutral continent by 2050. We set out on this journey already in 2019. Today, many countries around the globe are in an exciting race to zero. And I was delighted that you, President Moon, announced that Korea is also aiming to be climate neutral by 2050. Even though the finish line is 30 years away, the race starts now. The 2020s is the make or break decade. And that's why Europe has committed to reduce our emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has met his Hungarian counterpart in the latest round of talks in the city of Guiyang in southwest China's Guizhou province. The meeting took place as Wang Yi hosted the foreign ministers of Poland, Serbia and Ireland over the weekend. CGTN's Sui Hoi Ao reports.
Serbia, Poland, Ireland and Hungary. The top diplomats of these four countries are here to discuss the future of China-Europe relations. China says it values its ties with Europe, and the numbers tell the story. On average, the two sides do over 1 billion euros of trade a day. But trade is not everything. Geopolitically, the triangular relationship between China, the EU, and the US make things complicated. Washington sees China as its biggest rival or even a threat. But Europe has a more nuanced view of China. In theory, these differences provide an opportunity for Beijing. For one, the EU has shown a willingness to chart a path of growing strategic independence. This became clear during the Trump administration. The EU has put Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, or CAI, on hold. They say they won't start rectifying it unless China lifts the sanctions on certain EU officials. But China maintains its sanctions were simply a response to what it calls unsubstantiated attacks over Xinjiang.
The China-EU investment agreement is a balanced win-win deal rather than a gift bestowed by one side to the other. China is sincere about advancing bilateral relations. We hope the EU side will work in the same direction as China.
So given these developments, what can China do? The answer is be proactive. Take this round of high-level meetings as an example. China is hoping to solidify its friendship with friends in Europe. Instead of sitting still and waiting, Chinese diplomats are reaching out to try and turn things around. Serbia is China's comprehensive strategic partner. Their friendship was strengthened during the pandemic. Poland is an important ally of the US, but also wants more access to China's trade market. Ireland is looking to protect its trade surplus with China and is looking at closer connections to Chinese financial markets, and Hungary, which has a history of political and economic differences with Washington and Brussels, is clearly looking east.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Experts say the global economy is partying like it's 1973, but the mood music could change.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of a story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London. Who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link, only on CGTN. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
welcome back. A reminder that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online, on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV. You can also find us on YouTube and Daily Motion, as well as CGTN.com and on the CGTN app. Next, China has further eased its birth limits, saying couples may now have up to 3 children. It comes as the country's annual births plummeted to a record low of 12 million in 2020. On average, each Chinese woman has 1.3 children, well below the 2.1 that would maintain the size of the population. The policy change comes with supportive measures. Authorities say that they will lower the costs of education and improve maternity leave and insurance systems and step up tax and housing support. Bert Hoffman is director of the National University of Singapore's East Asian Institute. I asked him how much of an impact the 3-child policy will have.
If you look at the estimate of how many babies Chinese women want to have in their lifetime, right now it is 1.3. So lifting it up to 3 will matter for some people, but not that many. And there's some people in rural areas, minorities that like to have more children than 2. So for them it matters, but that's a really small minority in China. However, the Politburo also announced supporting measures. We don't know yet what they have in mind, but those supporting measures are quite important so that people also see different incentives for getting children. And they could include better child care, they could include better arrangements for keeping one's job or even being supported by employers in having children. And some countries even give baby bonuses, as they say, basically money for babies. That's important because it's quite expensive to have a child in China, not just in China, but in many emerging economies, because you need a bigger house, you need to get your kid in school, you need to get them to good universities. All of that costs money.
Do you think this new policy will do anything to address the gender imbalance in China, where many more boys are born than girls?
Well, I think the relaxation to 2 children has already shown some of that. If you look at the most recent births and in the census, the gender imbalance has already come down. At its peak, it was 118 boys for every 100 girls. The latest data show 110 boys for every 100 girls. So that's already coming down. Naturally, it's about 106. So with further relaxation of the number of children, that might come closer to this natural 106, 107.
Now, it's not just China dealing with these changing demographics, is it, and ageing populations. Countries like Japan especially concerned about having enough younger people to pay for elderly people. Is China's situation any different?
It's a little different in 2 ways. First of all, I mean, China is not yet that old. Their share of the population over 65, which people normally see as old when it hits 14%. China is still just under it. So China is not yet that old. China is also still a lot younger and has a lot more to grow and needs to build some of the systems that can adapt to some of this aging that is coming down the line, notably pension system, but also health systems. And the third is that was announced today that they're going to push the retirement age higher in a gradual fashion. But there's many areas where China can reform so that it is better prepared. That's different from countries that are already aged and old. They have less room for maneuver, if you want.
Most of the world will recover to pre-pandemic levels of economic activity by next year. But some countries will find it more difficult than others. That's according to the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. The Paris-based organisation has raised its forecast for the year to nearly 6%. It's also upgraded its outlook for 2022 to nearly 4.5%. The OECD says the rosier picture is due to vaccination efforts and substantial government stimulus across the globe. Now, in Europe, growth is now forecast to be comfortably above 4%. But again, the OECD warns the recovery will be uneven and living standards in many developed economies will take longer to recover.
The chief economist at the OECD says the forecasts are the highest in nearly 50 years.
The prospects for the global economy have improved considerably in recent months, and the outlook is brightening. So we have revised up our growth projections for 2021 to the highest growth rate since 1973. And that's thanks to progress in vaccination, economies coping better with restrictions, massive fiscal and monetary support.
The OECD's Laurence Boone there. Well, let's talk to Brendan Brown. He's an economist and founding partner at Macro Hedge Advisors. Good to see you, Brendan. Now, look, the OECD is forecasting what they call an uneven recovery. So who or where stands out for you and who's falling short?
Well, what stands out is that the US and South Korea are already back to their pre-pandemic levels of output. Germany and Japan, by the end of this year, will be at their pre-pandemic levels of output per head. When you look at the rest of Europe, Britain, France, Italy, it's well into 2022. And some developing countries like Brazil, Argentina, South Africa are going to be into 2023 and beyond. It's very important to remember. It's very important to remember here that this is just getting back to pre-pandemic levels. There's also been a huge cumulative loss of income during that time.
Now, you mentioned the UK, and their growth set to be the fastest among the large, rich economies, although you could argue that they've got further to go because they were hit so hard. So let's talk about risk and potential longer-term damage, considering the UK also bears those scars of Brexit.
Yeah, the risks more generally than for the UK that the OECD are highlighting is inflation, that there's going to be a pickup of prices with various shortages, disruptions, and that this may lead to higher interest rates. So that's one risk. Another risk is clearly on the pandemic itself and whether it recedes smoothly or not. I would say a big risk they miss out altogether is that asset inflation, which has been fueled during all this central bank radical action, could, for various reasons, short-circuit.
Post-pandemic, how far do you think the investment priority shopping list will shift? Or do you think we are still looking at things like health, like education, digital transformation and climate transition?
Well, health, everyone would agree on, is a priority, but the other items which the OECD is just trying to justify, such as digitalization and environmental, that's much more questionable because, first of all, we had a big boom in digitalization during the pandemic, and some people would say that in some sectors that may even have gone too far. So it's quite unclear why the state or government should be in any way sponsoring that. Another point one can take issue with the OECD is they're justifying the state coming in and boosting spending because they say interest rates are so low. But interest rates are only so low because central banks everywhere are effectively keeping interest rates very low as a way of taxing their citizens to pay for the vast debt they ran up during the pandemic. So it's a sort of circular argument.
Looking ahead as well, the OECD expects volatility on financial markets. I mean, is it, Brendan, is it all about the vaccination drive in the developing world, or is that something else at play here?
Well, clearly any setback in vaccinations would upset markets, but we're also looking at very high valuations in a wide range of equity and real estate markets, very high leverage in the corporate sector, and of course for some weak sovereigns have huge debts too. So there's a whole range of accidents that could occur here.
Brendan Brown at Macro Hedge Advisors, always a pleasure. Thank you very much for your insight.
Thank you.
Germany's latest inflation figures are pushing further above the European Central Bank's target of below 2%. Annual consumer prices in Germany hit 2.4% in May. Many economists worry the pandemic recovery could overheat economies and trigger too much inflation.
The European Commission has suggested travellers should be exempt from testing or quarantine when going from one EU country to another. Many of the EU members are hoping for a busy summer of tourism in order to help their economic recovery. Brussels has already agreed a scheme for vaccinated people to receive an electronic certificate.
US chipmaker Intel is warning it could take several years for the shortage of semiconductor chips to be resolved. CEO Pat Gelsinger said the work from home trends since the pandemic has led to explosive growth in demand for semiconductors. That's put huge pressure on global supply chains.
Carlos Ghosn is in court again. French investigating judges are in Beirut questioning the fugitive former car executive on allegations of financial misconduct. Ghosn, who holds French citizenship, has been fighting multiple probes around his financial arrangements since fleeing to Lebanon in late 2019.
JD Logistics, the delivery arm of Chinese e-commerce giant JD.com, has started trading on the Hong Kong stock market. It's the second biggest initial public offering in Hong Kong this year.
The company raised around $3.2 billion in Friday's debut. Our reporter Yu Yang spoke to CEO Yu Rui in an exclusive interview.
For the past 10 years, JD Logistics has been growing comprehensively. Its main mission has been to create an integrated supply chain. As of 2020, we have provided service for 190,000 companies and clients all over the world. We will use the money for upgrading and expanding logistics networks, developing supply chain technologies, and general corporate purposes, among others. We hope to promote the construction of integrated supply chains through technology while helping to boost the real economy and emerging industries.
JD Logistics has long suffered from losses. Do you think Hong Kong listing is going to help ease the situation?
Of course, we hope our profit margin and revenue can achieve long-term, stable growth. But there are lots of reasons why we have seen some losses. First of all, our business has been hit by the pandemic. Last year, we had no returns on our investments for 2 to 3 quarters due to the outbreak. Meanwhile, some local governments subsidized us last year, but this year it didn't happen. However, most of our investment is used in our workforce, as well as in our research and development department. Thus, we are still hopeful about the future and believe the situation will get better.
Well, some say there's a fierce competition in China's logistics field, and some even say there's already triggered price war. Where do you think the industry headed in the future?
I think the most important factor for the development of the logistics industry is the type of services it can offer. I believe the so-called price war in the industry mostly happened because some enterprises can only provide delivery services. But customers need solutions for all the problems they encounter in the supply chain, and that's not just limited to delivery.
Stay with us. Still to come, tackling COVID. The home of English rugby becomes a mass vaccination site as the UK ramps up its rollout, ahead of a looming third wave.
More than 100,000 people in Italy have now died from COVID-19.
The vaccination programme offers some hope for the future, but intensive care units are near capacity.
The Spanish government is hoping to vaccinate over 1 million people by next month.
Living in Germany are struggling with their mental health.
Hungary is supplementing the EU's vaccine rollout, buying doses from Russia and China to speed up the process.
4 million people have tested positive in France.
After a grim winter, the promise of a spring bloom that could mean freedom for millions.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
Roger, you're loud and clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we try to save the world.
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with me, Juliette Mann, and Paul Barber. Our top stories. Spying on your friends is not acceptable. The comment from President Macron as he demands answers to allegations that Denmark helped the US with surveillance on key allies.
And China allows couples to have 3 children as birth rates fall in the world's most populous country.
Russia has refused permits for 2 Air France flights after the airline said it would avoid Belarus airspace. Several flights were cancelled 4 days ago. Then, over the weekend, the situation appeared to have been resolved.
Russia has also vowed to defend Belarus if the European Union imposes economic sanctions. It follows the forced diversion of a passenger plane last week. Julia Chapman is live in Moscow for us now. Julia, Russia appeared to accept flights avoiding Belarus on Saturday. What's changed?
Well, 2 Air France flights from Paris to Moscow had to be cancelled today after Russian authorities failed to give authorization to the new route that was planned to circumvent Belarus and avoid its airspace. And that comes, of course, after as you said, a few flights over the weekend did in fact go forward. But Air France says that this was all part of a seasonal renewal process of their routes and they had to be resubmitted. So it could partly just be bureaucracy rather than an active blocking of these flights by Russia. But it comes after quite a chummy weekend between the presidents of Russia and Belarus, despite the diversion of that Ryanair plane into Minsk last week, where a opposition blogger was arrested. President Vladimir Putin giving the green light to send the next tranche of a loan to Belarus, and that comes despite continuing condemnation from the West over the incident last Sunday. We've heard from the EU Internal Market Commissioner Thierry Breton, who called it a hijacking. We've also heard from NATO today that says the Belarusian delegation to NATO will have reduced access to NATO because of the incident that happened last week. So quite a lot of still concern from the European Union, but Russia vowing today to stand by Belarus in the face of additional sanctions that are expected.
And Julia, the exiled opposition leader has been in Estonia today. What did she have to say?
That's right. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was meeting with the Estonian president, prime minister, and some senior lawmakers as well, as she continues her tour of Europe, trying to gain some recognition for her cause. At a press conference, she said that she understood the Belarusian opposition fight would be a long one, but she vowed to continue, and she says she and her supporters simply want free and fair elections. They don't want revenge on Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus. Nevertheless, she did call for Estonia and other EU countries to broaden their sanctions against his government and to maintain a firm stance against him. This is what she had to say earlier.
Lukashenko has brought Belarus on a path of self-destruction for the sake of personal power and glory. His regime is now a threat to regional and European security. Estonia is very close to Belarus, therefore the reaction of your country needs to be strong and effective.
Svetlana Tikhanovskaya also said her team has been in touch with lawyers for the 2 people who were detained in Belarus after the Ryanair flight diversion. Roman Protasevich, the opposition blogger who is a Belarusian citizen, and his girlfriend Sofia Sapega, who is a Russian citizen. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya says Roman Protasevich has been tortured. She hasn't presented any evidence for that, and of course the Belarusian government denies that he's been treated poorly. But we were also expecting to get some details on what Sofia Sapega has been accused with today. We haven't heard those yet. The charges remain unclear against her, but her lawyer has been speaking today and says she is suffering from panic attacks in prison.
Julia Chapman in Moscow, many thanks.
Political rivals of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are racing to oust him in last-ditch coalition talks before a Wednesday deadline. Hard-right tech millionaire Naftali Bennett is negotiating with centrist former TV anchor Yair Lapid on forming an unlikely alliance that would end the Netanyahu era. Emily Ross reports.
It's a very fragile situation when we're looking at the reports of the coalition that Lapid has managed to bring together. It's still very fragile. Even one defector from that crowd could cause the whole thing to fall down.
There are still plenty of obstacles on the way to forming a new government. Maybe that's a good thing, because we'll have to overcome them together. That's our first test, to see if we can find smart compromises in the coming days to achieve the greater goal.
He has a deadline, a Wednesday deadline, whereby he must come to the president, present a coalition, otherwise he loses that opportunity. But reports are saying that he really could pull it off as early as today or tomorrow. He spent overnight negotiating with all of the different parties that he sees as part of this coalition, overnight talks, trying to nail out the deals, who would be part of what ministries and what role they would play. Naftali Bennett is a religious Zionist leader. His party believes in a religious version and a religious vision for Israel, but it's still Zionist, unlike the ultra-Orthodox parties. Now, what makes him and sets him apart is many of his policies regarding Palestinians in the West Bank. He's known as a firebrand right-winger, and a lot of the criticism that he came under within the past 48 hours, and specifically after that speech that he gave yesterday from people in his own camp, is that he's betraying the right. That's what they're saying. And Netanyahu himself echoed that sentiment in his speech right after. He said that Naftali Bennett was betraying the right wing. That being said, if they join this coalition and they go through with it, as it looks like they will face harsh opposition from within their own camp. They stand to perhaps lose some political clout among their own base, but it seems as though Bennett is determined to do so regardless. It seems as though he wants to plow on. And what really indicates this change block, what's indicative of their spirit, is that they're going for something that is a change from Netanyahu, a change from this government, a change from what we've seen over the past 12 years here in Israel, and that's what brings them together, not necessarily political ideology. It looks as though he might face backlash from that, but he's going to go ahead with it anyway.
Emily Rose there in Tel Aviv.
The World Health Organization says it will consider recommendations for sweeping reforms in order to better handle future pandemics. The organization has faced some strong criticism over how it's handled the coronavirus outbreak. Emergencies Director at the WHO, Mike Ryan, said he welcomes the proposals.
Right now, the pathogens have the upper hand. They're emerging more frequently and often silently in a planet that's out of balance. And as we've seen with Ebola, we've seen with other diseases, they can amplify and spread in our communities and our healthcare facilities, unknown, unseen and undetected, until they then spread within countries and between countries, endangering all of humanity.
In the UK, the vaccination campaign progresses, but scientists fear Britain is already in the early stages of a third wave of coronavirus infections. Nicole Johnston reports.
The home of English rugby, Twickenham Football Stadium, is being turned into a mass vaccination centre. It can jab up to 15,000 people per day here, and you don't need to book in for an appointment.
I think it's partly we live so close to Hounslow where there's a big rise in cases, but also I just sort of want the whole country just to come out of lockdown, hopefully 21st of June. So
I wanted to come down because everything's opening up now, and I just wanted to make sure that I'm staying safe and I don't risk spreading it to people.
This vaccination centre is part of a massive effort to try and drive down the numbers of the new variant that was first identified in India. It's spreading across parts of the UK, especially in the northwest and in Hounslow, which is close to here. And it now accounts for at least 3/4 of new infections in the UK. In other parts of the country, the army is delivering testing kits to people to try and stop it from spreading. At the same time, a senior scientist advising the government says the country is in the early stages of a third wave of the virus, and the variant first identified in India is behind it. Professor Ravi Gupta from the University of Cambridge said the third wave will probably take longer to emerge because of the high vaccination levels. Professor Gupta is calling on the government to delay the next phase of its reopening, which was due to happen on the 21st of June. But the government says it will make a decision in 2 weeks' time. Nicole Johnston, CGTN, London.
In France, from Monday, anyone aged 18 or older can now be inoculated. It makes France one of the first major European countries to offer COVID vaccines to all adults. Lucy Hoff has more from Paris.
There's set to be huge demand across France at centres like the one behind me as the country expands its vaccine rollout to anyone over the age of 18. Previously, to get an appointment here, you'd need to be over the age of 50, be a younger person with a pre-existing medical condition, or you'd have to be a worker in a key sector. But from Monday, that all changes, and some 28 million people are now eligible to come to a centre like this one and receive a jab. But that means there's going to be enormous pressure on appointment booking systems, and the privately run website Doctolib is saying that it may not be able to give everyone that applies a vaccine due to the levels of supply of vaccines like Pfizer and Moderna. But nonetheless, this is a hugely positive milestone for France, which has managed to turn around its initially slow rollout and has now managed to inoculate nearly 40% of its population. That's some 26 million people, and that number is set to receive a big boost through the month of June. There are also signs that as people start to enjoy some newfound freedoms, taking a drink on a terrace of a bar or a restaurant, that the high levels of vaccine scepticism here are starting to wane. So June is likely to be a critical month for France as it moves to the next stage of easing its lockdown restrictions, as well as a huge ramping up of its inoculation campaign. Lucy Hoff, CGTN, Paris.
And we'll stay in Paris because cinemas, theatres and comedy venues are all opening up again in France, but with strict conditions. Audiences can only be a third of normal capacity, and the curtain must come down by 9 p.m, a nightly curfew. Ross Cullen reports.
It's no joke. France has at last reopened its cultural venues after a 6-month coronavirus shutdown. Places like this comedy club in Paris were closed to performers and audiences. They're open again, but still restricted by the 9 p.m. curfew. For the owners, it's a relief to be able to laugh together again.
I was never afraid comedians wouldn't come back. During the lockdown, they were asking us if we were open. Our fear was more about the public, but they are here and we thank them for that.
The comedies of the stage were cancelled as the tragedy of the second and third wave of COVID-19 infections hit France. There are nearly 700,000 people working in France's culture sector, and when theatres closed, it meant actors, directors and front-of-house staff could not work. They have since adapted their working practices to the signs of the times, making their venues COVID-19 compliant. After 6 months of closure, the culture sector in France is ready to stage its post-lockdown revival. But that cultural shutdown from last autumn to this spring went on too long for the director of this playhouse in Paris.
I fought a lot against the Ministry of Culture. I fought because I realised they weren't taking care of culture, that this was just a little thing for them. It was a very political stance. Maybe they didn't want to seem like they were giving us preferential treatment over restaurants and bars. But here it's totally different. The audience has to wear a face mask. They don't take it off to eat. We are in a very secure place that respects all the government's COVID-19 restrictions.
Actors did not take the 6-month closure willingly. The Odeon is one of France's 6 national theatres, and it was one of around 100 theatres occupied this year by protesters. The government granted a 4-month extension to its special COVID-19 relief programme for entertainment workers, but the demonstrators were calling for a year-long extension instead. The coronavirus lockdowns were no laughing matter. But the reopening of cultural venues has at least lightened the mood after 6 months of shutdown. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
Poland is continuing to relax COVID restrictions. Children over 10 are returning to school after 8 months away from the classroom. It's the latest in a series of gradual steps out of lockdown, including hotels, shops, cinemas and swimming pools reopening. And people are being allowed to dine indoors at restaurants.
Ghana's foreign minister says Mali has been suspended from the West African trade bloc, ECOWAS. That's following the country's second coup in 9 months. The decision was taken at an emergency summit in Accra. Regional leaders decided against imposing sanctions, but said the country must stick to a timetable for a return to democratic rule.
The foreign ministers of Turkey and Greece have announced their leaders will meet next month on the sidelines of a NATO summit. Greek Foreign Minister Nikos Dendias met his Turkish counterpart Mevlut Çavuşoğlu in Athens. They're trying to smooth relations, having been at odds for decades on a number of issues. They also agreed to recognise each other's COVID vaccination certificates to facilitate tourism.
A far-right nationalist party has made significant gains in parliamentary elections in Cyprus. Elam has nearly doubled its support with almost 7% of the vote. That's after Cypriots punished the ruling Conservative DC party for a series of corruption scandals. Both DC and communist Arkel held their positions as the two largest parties on the island.
In New Zealand, hundreds of people have been evacuated from their homes as heavy rain caused widespread flooding in the country's Canterbury region. The military has been called in to help after a state of emergency was declared over the weekend. Several places have received as much as 40 centimetres of rain in the past 24 hours.
Brazil will host the Copa America football tournament, which is due to kick off in mid-June. That's after Colombia and then Argentina were rejected as hosts. The South American Championship was taken away from Colombia following street protests. Argentina pulled out amid an increase in COVID-19 cases. The move to Brazil comes despite high infection levels there.
The U.S. city of Tulsa in Oklahoma is commemorating the anniversary of a race riot. Hundreds of black residents are reported to have died in 1921 as a white mob attacked them and burned their homes and businesses. Now the city is searching for the remains of the victims. Hendrik Sybrandi reports.
At Oaklawn Cemetery, Tulsa's oldest existing cemetery, a crew prepares one far corner for excavation work that's set to begin on Tuesday. The city hopes to exhume remains of black residents who may have been buried here.
Well, we're at a pivotal point.
Scott Ellsworth is the foremost historian of the Tulsa Race Massacre, an outburst of racial violence in which hundreds of blacks are thought to have died at the hands of a white mob over 2 bloody days in 1921.
I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire.
The attack was suppressed for many years afterwards. The victims remain largely unaccounted for to this day.
These people were thrown away. Their loved ones were all held under armed guard in internment centers. They never found out what happened to their father, their brother, their aunt, their son. They were never told where they were buried.
This headstone marks the grave of Eddie Lockhart, who died on June 1st, 1921 at age 42. It's one of only 2 known marked graves of massacre victims here in the cemetery. A year ago, based on oral histories of massacre survivors and information from ground-penetrating radar, the city finally began digging at Oaklawn, considered one of the likeliest mass grave sites. Then last October, using records from white-owned funeral homes here in the so-called Black Paupers burial area, came a dramatic discovery.
12 coffins side by side, 2 by 2, plain pine box coffins.
Oh, and the caskets are close to each other. They're packed in. And so that's also, it's a mass grave, clearly.
Forensic anthropologist Phoebe Stubblefield has been part of the excavation team.
The bones are in extremely fragile condition, but it's the hope that the forensic scientists and the osteologists can determine age, gender, cause of death.
I'm thinking we'll get DNA. The teeth are shown. We're getting teeth in a poor casket or a great casket. There's still teeth well preserved, and they look great.
She says the fact the remains are not embalmed helps. Searchers will look for signs of bullet wounds, burn marks, and trauma. But identifying victims may prove difficult, and holding anyone criminally responsible for the killings will be impossible.
Basically what we call in the law vicarious liability for criminal conduct of other persons who can't be charged with the crimes, and they simply can't be because they're deceased.
The next phase of excavation could last weeks or even months. 2 other sites where bodies may have been dumped have yet to be explored.
This is a very meticulous, scientific, slow process, and we may or may not have answers at the end.
The goal is to honor those who perished with proper burials.
Tulsa, interestingly, because it had such a big skeleton in its closet, we're ahead of the rest of the country. And hopefully this can help show other communities on how to deal with their own past.
Only truth, he and others say, can bring healing and justice and help cities like these move into the future. Henrik Sabrandi, CGTN, Tulsa.
You're watching Global Business Europe. Still ahead, a herd of elephants is breaking the boundaries between man and the wild.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
And welcome back. Big Tobacco has faced a tough few years with more regulation, advertising bans and falling sales.
Vaping is now in the spotlight as the new rising force in the industry. But the long-term effects are unknown. Louise Jabarkle reports.
Open again after lockdown, business is rebounding at this South London vape store.
It's like a mouth to lung, so yeah. Really nice finish.
Last year, the market for electronic cigarettes in the UK was 5 times bigger than it was in 2012, worth almost $3 billion.
I think a lot of people want to quit smoking, you know. I think what it is, a lot of people can't smoke in the pubs anymore, and it's also second-hand passive smoking. They care about their families, and people are taking care about their health a little bit more, and also with COVID, they sort of looking after themselves a bit more.
Given their rising popularity, the government's also using them. A trial at 5 hospitals in England and Scotland will give patients discharged from emergency wards vaping starter packs to help them quit cigarettes. Researchers are hoping to reach 1,000 people across both countries.
Public Health England review all the evidence every year and currently estimate that e-cigarettes are about 95% less harmful than tobacco smoking. So it's a harm reduction option. We can't say, of course, that e-cigarettes are completely safe for health, but they're much, much less harmful than continuing to smoke tobacco.
It's not just the health implications that could be important. This vaping kit costs about $20, roughly the same as a 20-pack of cigarettes. But if the kits help people turn their backs on tobacco altogether, it could save the Public Health Service billions in the long term.
According to official figures, about 2.7 million adults vape in the UK, with up to 7 million smoking cigarettes. The long-term effects of e-cigarettes are still unclear, but with an official aim to make England smoke-free by 2030, they could be an even bigger part of public policy in the years to come. Nawi Jabakil, CGTN, London.
15 wild elephants are on the loose in southwestern China after breaking out of a nature reserve.
Yes, the herd has damaged buildings and farmland as they move north towards more densely populated areas in Yunnan province. Mark Kerr reports.
Trampling farmland, breaking into stores and houses. The elephants' behavior has become bolder as they enter more populated areas of Yunnan.
5 members of the herd has broken into this villager's barn. As you can see, they've knocked down the gate. If we take a closer look, here's a giant footprint on the gate. And as they entered the gate, you can see their giant body has grazed through the roof.
We were sleeping in the attic. At around 1 o'clock in the morning, we heard noises. I looked through the window and saw 2 adult elephants in the yard. They then called other elephants to eat too. I called the village head. He told me, "Don't move, don't make a sound."
This is the latest incident of the elephants invading areas inhabited by humans and destroying buildings and eating crops. The animals left their natural habitat in Xishuangbanna last March in search of food. And since then, they found human settlements provide the best option.
They stepped on my rice field first, but there was nothing to eat. So they went up and found my barn and ate my grains.
The family of 9 adults and 6 calves are now on a generally northward route towards the provincial capital of Kunming. This has ignited fierce debate online. Some are calling for the elephants to be put down before they cause more damage. Others argue against it.
We've considered a lot about how to lead them away from residential areas. It's not recommended at the current state to use force, since it will lead to injuries, even death, of both people and elephants. Currently, we're considering using food to guide them back to the spots where they usually find food during this time of the year.
The number of wild Asian elephants has grown from under 200 to around 300 in 30 years due to the establishment of natural reserves. Human-elephant conflict is not uncommon in Yunnan. 10 out of 11 natural reserves in the province have high forest density. With more animals moving in and competing for food, more elephants are forced out of the reserves, just like this herd. 马克 CGTN 玉溪.
And finally, mealworm is about to be crawling onto the shelves of supermarkets and restaurants across the EU.
That's after the European Food Safety Agency approved the creepy crawly as fit for human consumption earlier this month. Experts believe mealworm and other insects could offer a sustainable and low-carbon food source for the future. Plus, they're full of protein and high in fat and fibre, so they're nutritious. But I'm not so sure about delicious.
I don't know, it's making me hungry.
No.
The headlines again. French President Emmanuel Macron demands answers to allegations that Denmark helped the US with surveillance on key allies.
Si l'information est juste.
If the information is true, I simply say that this is unacceptable amongst friends.
De manière.
China allows couples to have 3 children as birth rates fall in the world's most populous country.
And is it bye-bye Bibi? Netanyahu's rivals work to finalise a coalition to unseat Israel's longest-serving leader.
Well, that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching. More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com and follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, on Facebook and on Instagram.
We're available on smart TV apps like Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV. You can also find us on YouTube and Dailymotion, as well as at cgtn.com and on the CGTN app. From us and the rest of the team in London, goodbye.